Hi friends, today we're going to talk about the start of the Civil War, the goals and aims and advantages on both sides of the Civil War, and what's going on for people who live at home and aren't fighting in the war, but the war is happening around them, and that's called the home front. So the first action, it's not the first battle, but the first action of the Civil War is called Fort Sumter. Fort Sumter is in South Carolina. It's one of the last Union strongholds in the South, in South Carolina, meaning that the Union Army had a fort there. So the South Carolina government asked the Union forces to vacate because they said, we're no longer part of the United States anymore. We don't want your military here. But those Union forces decided to stay under the command of Lincoln. And so Lincoln's kind of got a decision here. Does he fortify the fort, meaning send more men and supplies and ammo? Does he pull them out? Does he ask them to fight up against the South? And it's kind of like an island a little bit off the coast of Charleston, South Carolina. And so what Lincoln chooses is to send ships with supplies. And when that ship gets to Fort Sumter and restocks with some food and weaponry, then the Confederate President Jefferson Davis decided to fire at Fort Sumter, and these are the first shots of the Civil War on April 12th, 1861. And it happened for about 35 hours. The Confederates were firing on the Union Army stronghold out in the middle of the ocean, off the coast of South Carolina, and the Confederates were actually successful. The Union Army in this first action surrenders, and all of the people at Fort Sumter were allowed to go back to Washington, D.C. to go home. And at that point, Lincoln says, well, I guess we're in a war. The Confederates were successful, and now they're fighting us. We got to fight back. And Lincoln calls for volunteers to serve in an army for 90 days, hoping that it won't last very long. So it's not a draft, it's just volunteers in the beginning. So the war has started, and different people have to choose sides. Now, this isn't in your notes. We've already written down all the Confederate states, and that's not correct. That's supposed to say joined the Confederate States of America. Sorry. So Virginia, Arkansas, and Tennessee, North Carolina, they all seceded. Now the whole South is part of the Confederate States of America, except for the border states. So the border states were slave states that were still in the Union, became important. And those border states are Delaware, Missouri, Maryland, and Kentucky. And Lincoln was quoted as saying, I hope to have God on my side, but I must have Kentucky. Basically saying that Kentucky and all those border states that had slaves but stayed with the Union were integral, were important to the Civil War cause for the North because they had lots of people and resources that the North needed. Let's talk about resources. So North is over here. What does the North have? What are the aspects of that region during each war? So the North is called the Union in this war, and they have more people. They have an immigrant population in the cities. They have more industry, factories making boots and belts and guns and ammo and gunpowder. They have railroads that can transport people and goods. They have more war supplies because of their factories, and they were led by great leadership in Abraham Lincoln. Next, the South is called the Confederacy. And they are led by a great General Robert E. Lee, who was from Virginia. And actually, he was so good, he was so well known as being a good military official, that when the war first broke out, Lincoln invited him to the White House and said, will you please be on the side of the Union? Like, that's how good you are. And when Virginia seceded, he said, I'm sorry, Lincoln, I have to go with Virginia. That's where I'm from. I have to go with my own state. So he ended up joining the Confederacy as a military leader. The South had support of its people. Many people thought that the war was more about states' rights. The state has the right to secede if they want to. But at the core of it all was slavery and fighting to protect what the South thought was a right of slavery. They are fighting a defensive war, whereas the North had to fight offensively. They had to go down and take. The South just had to defend their own territory. They weren't trying to expand or get anything back. They didn't have many factories. So no factories, I don't want to say no, but few factories in the South. So that means that they don't have the military resources that the North has. Same with railroads. They had few railroads, so getting supplies and troops places was a lot harder for the South. And then their president was Jefferson Davis. All right, so what are their goals for the war? The North wants to fight to save the Union, preserve the Union. Preserve the Union, put the North and South back together. In the beginning of the war, it will change midway, but in the beginning of the war, Lincoln isn't worried about slavery. He just wants the border states and the non-abolitionists that are in the North to stick with him. Halfway through the war, that's going to change, and it's going to change the purpose of the war from preserving the Union to ending slavery. But in the beginning, it's all about putting everything back together, North and South, into one country. And in the South, their goal is to be left alone. We want to remain the Confederate States of America, and we want to be allowed to have slavery unchanged. They're going to fight defensively. They're going to hope that England will come help them, but that's not actually the case. So it will just be North versus South with no outside foreign help. The Civil War is known as the first modern war because of the new technology that was used. The Industrial Revolution had caused things to be mass-produced in factories at this time. So goods are easier to get your hands on if they're in the North, and the military was much better supplied in the North, and also because of the railroad and new types of bullets, which we're going to go over at a different time. New technology made it more modern. But new technology also meant that more soldiers will end up getting killed because of the new techniques, new war techniques. All right, life during the Civil War. If you lived in America during the Civil War, different groups had different experiences. African Americans, it depended on whether they were enslaved or freedmen. So the labor of enslaved African Americans was actually forced to help the war effort in the South. They provided food by continuing to run the plantations and farms. They were often drug around by the military and forced to dig railroads and ditches and trenches for the war effort. Once the Union kind of starts winning and gets down into the South, they will start freeing slaves as they go through. So thousands of slaves escape and join the Union troops and fight on the side of the Union. There were some all-black regiments during the Civil War. But things kind of change on January 1st, 1863, when Abraham Lincoln issues what's known as the Emancipation Proclamation Act. And this emancipation means free, proclamation means he's declaring it. That freed enslaved people in all Confederate states, not border states. So basically saying if you live in the Confederacy and you're a slave, you're freed. Now that didn't exactly happen until slaves were forcibly freed when the Union Army starts winning and goes deeper and deeper down into the South to free them. But the idea is there that the federal government is going to win this war, reunite the North and South, and free all the slaves. So the proclamation, what it did do in the North is help African Americans feel like the goal of the war was to end slavery so that they join. So it does change the goal of the war to preserving the Union, from preserving the Union to ending slavery. And actually, 180,000 African Americans serve in the Union Army during the war in all-black regiments. What about soldiers? Yes, people died on the battlefield, but the biggest thing people died from was injury and disease. So epidemics that have nothing to do with injury, like measles, mumps, sweep through camps. And then gangrene kills those who have wounds that aren't properly cleaned and then get infected, and they die from that infection, leaving their wounds and going up into their body. Being a soldier was boring until battle time. They spent their time in camps. Sometimes they had to go scavenging for food if they weren't supplied properly, especially Southern troops. The North had a lot more supplies. Between drills, they wrote letters, they played cards, baseball, they exercised, they hung out, they read if they were able to read. So conditions weren't great because of the disease. They didn't have a bunch of modern medicine. Amputations just kind of happened. Like if you had a bullet wound, they were able to get the bullet out, but then it got infected. They might just chop off your leg from where the bullet was down instead of because they didn't have modern medicine to make it better, to fix it so that the infection would go away. So they would just chop off the infection, and we had a lot of Civil War vets who left the war with a lot of injuries and amputations. Conditions for prisoners were even worse. So if you were a prisoner of war, meaning that you're a northern soldier who's taken as prisoner by the South, or a southern soldier who's taken as prisoner by the North, both sides had terrible prison camps. In Andersonville, Georgia, the Confederacy took Union prisoners of war, and in Elmira, New York, the Union Army took Southern prisoners of war who were barely given food, barely given water. Disease was rampant. Their injuries weren't treated. And it was just a intimidation and scare tactic for both sides to have these horrible prison camps. What if you're just a regular person living at home during the Civil War? Most of the fighting occurred in the South. So if you are living on a plantation in the South or in a city in the South, it is very likely that you saw some fighting. Some of that happened here in Kentucky. The Battle of Perryville happened in Perryville, Kentucky. There's a battlefield there now that you can go walk around, and they do reenactments of the battle. There was huge property damage in the South because all of this is happening in the South. The Union Army would take up their railroads, what little railroads they had, and heat them up and bend them around trees to break the steel so it couldn't be used again. Plantations were burned down just to try and cripple the South. Livestock were taken or killed for food. So if you had horses and the Union Army sweeps through, then your horses were taken from you and used for the Union Army. There were food shortages because there wasn't enough food because the North was blockading the South. There was rampant inflation. Things that used to cost a few dollars now cost hundreds of dollars. People didn't have enough money to buy the necessities. And there was a huge anti-war movement in response to the draft. People didn't want to be drafted into the war for any time period. It was just for males. It's called the Selective Service Act. Sometimes it's called conscription. I'm going to write that word in case you ever run across it. Conscription or selective service. So both of those words mean that you are told, if you're a young white male during this time, you are told you have to go join the war effort. These are your papers. You report here. We're going to train you and then send you off into battle. And there was a big response to this because, number one, no one wants to go to war unless they volunteer to be a soldier. And it was easy for rich people to get out of it. They could pay for a substitute. They could pay their way out. And so it ended up being a lot of poor people. And in the North, at first there was this spirit of, we're going to bring the South back in. We're going to end slavery. And slowly people start dissenting or getting upset with the war effort and just wanting it to end. So there was a Democratic group. They were part of the Democratic Party called Copperheads in the North who just completely opposed the war. They wanted it to end. They wanted it to be over. They didn't want to fight anymore. So women were also important during the Civil War. A small number disguised themselves as men and enlisted in the army, kind of like Mulan type. But for the most part, that wasn't as prevalent. Some women served as spies. They would take different messages and deliver them in a pile of laundry to another safe house where those messages would be sent by another woman somewhere else. But for the most part, women took up the man's role if the man had to go to war. So if the man was a business owner, his wife might take over the business and run it while he was gone. If a man was a plantation owner, then the wife might run the whole plantation and be in charge of all the enslaved peoples while the men left to fight. Now, in the Civil War, we do have groups of women that follow around different troops that acted as nurses. Prior to the Civil War, many of those nurses were male, but women stepped in during those roles in the war because the necessity for men to fight was so much. So 3,000 women served in the Union Army as nurses. And again, medicine was very not technologically advanced at the time. We'll talk a little bit more about medicine in a separate little activity. Women at home also ran relief societies. When I say relief societies, I mean charity, where they would have like big drives, like coat drives, shoe drives, food drives, gold and silver. Women would give up their jewelry so it could be melted down and sold as like a raw material, and the money would go towards the war effort. And both women and in the North and the South were doing these sort of things for the cause. All right.